Now let's look at the. I do want to talk to you about some history. There's a lot of parallels, right? One thing lots of the Chinese netizens discussed is first the Munich Agreement in 1938,
Mm.
where the Czechoslovakia was not at the table when
Mm.
Germany and France, Britain, right? They were negotiating Switzerland, right?
Yeah,
Which is part of Czechoslovakia, but
yeah,
Czechoslovakia was not even at the table, isn't it? What
yes.
was that whole thing? If
Yeah, it is absolutely correct. I mean, this is part of the so-called policy of appeasement. Now, I think the first thing to understand about what happened in 1938 is that Nazi Germany, Hitler, wanted war. I mean, he wanted war, and he was looking for reasons to start a war. So he wanted to start a war by creating issues over the treatment of German minorities in Czechoslovakia. And he stirred up the problems in Czechoslovakia and used that as an excuse to threaten Czechoslovakia. And the British and the French realized that Hitler wanted a war against Czechoslovakia. They were also aware that Czechoslovakia was an ally of the Soviet Union, which it was, and they didn't like that at all. The
Mhm.
British and the French didn't want to fight Germany at that time, didn't want to fight Nazi Germany at that time. So they did a deal directly with Hitler in which they carved up Czechoslovakia, and that was absolutely awful. That was a horrible deal. It is not what is going on between the Americans and the Russians at the moment. It's very different because what the Americans and the Russians are talking about at the present time is about steps to improve their relations. They're meeting tomorrow again in Istanbul to try to get their embassies. I mean,
Mhm.
the Russian embassy in America doesn't function. The American embassy in Moscow doesn't function. They want to sort out the problems with their embassies. They want to move towards a process of normalization. But if you look at all the statements that all of them have made, the Americans especially, the plan there is to try to get negotiations between Russia and Ukraine underway. So
Mhm.
people who say that Ukraine is being excluded are wrong.
Mhm.
By the way, and for the record, starting in August 2023 and continuing right up to the a meeting that took place last year in Switzerland, there were a series of meetings which the Western powers organised, which was supposed to work towards a peace in Ukraine, the Western powers and Ukraine organized, from which Russia was excluded. It's very strange how people have completely forgotten all about this. But the only people who were trying to exclude anybody from the substantive negotiations as to how to bring about peace were the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Biden administration.
Mhm. Yeah. And there's more discussions in China about the Paris Peace Conference,
Mm,
where the Treaty of Versailles was signed.
yeah,
Because that is, of course, after World War One, they
yeah.
were deciding how to punish Germany. But
Mm.
in the process, they didn't really return what German took from China back
Yeah.
to China. They gave it to Japan, the Shandong province, which is, you knew that it's totally angered China, the whole
Yeah.
thing, right?
Yeah.
So what is your comment on that?
Well, the Versailles Treaty was an absolute disaster. It was the last big flourish of European colonialism and imperialism. Obviously, they didn't consult China because China was the next country. They were part of the world they were hoping to carve up. I mean, this is the time, as you know, when China was. Yeah, I think it was Yuan Shikai was still the president of
Hezekiah.
China,
Mhm.
and anyway, the warlords, the British were basically running Yuan Shikai. They had Shanghai. They divided it up into the concessions that were there. The British had Hong Kong. So just giving bits of China to each other because they didn't they didn't take the Chinese people seriously.
Mhm.
I mean, as far as they were concerned, the Chinese were, just people like the Africans
Yeah.
and the others, the Indians, who, they should be colonized and ruled by the Europeans like everybody else. And the Europeans at that time took it absolutely for granted that they had the right to decide who governed which territory amongst themselves right across the world. I mean, it was not even something that in their arrogance they even considered that other nations had a word in. Now, the reason they gave it to Japan was because, of course, Britain had a strong alliance at that time with Japan. So the British thought of Japan not just as an ally, but almost as a kind of vassal state. This is, the British Empire, and Japan had joined the First World War against Germany. So this was going to be its reward. It was going to have, was it Tianjin and all of these places. So that was exactly how the Versailles Treaty was conducted. As I said, it's a world which has passed in terms of power, but not fully in terms of psychological understanding. The Europeans still think of themselves as superior to everyone else and still believe that they are the people who have the right ultimately to decide things for everyone else.
I think it's probably under Duan Qirui, but it's Yuan Shikai, Duan Qirui, the same group of people.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah, here's the thing though, the China also fought in World War One.
Yeah.
Both France and Britain, they used a lot of Chinese labor
Yeah.
and recruited, and they went to Europe, and many of them died there
I
fighting
know.
Germany.
I know.
And so China was regarded as on the ally side, which is the winning side.
Yes, I
And
know.
that's what angered China. And to this day, I think it's still a lot of people think this whole thing is just such a humiliation that
They do,
you're on the winning side, and this is how they treated you.
well,
So
exactly. I mean, they didn't take China seriously. And to this day, by the way, Westerners are unaware of the fact that China was fighting along in the First World War. They don't know about China's role in the Second World War
yeah,
either. I mean, as far as they're concerned, as I said, China at that time was a semi-colony, and that is all it was.
yeah. And then also now, just so for people who are not familiar with that part of it, it has actually is in this case the U.S. Warren Harding was the president of the United States. He's the one later. I mean, he's the one who had this Washington Naval Conference, right?
Yeah,
And in that conference, I think he mediated eventually when get Shandong province back to China, right?
that's
So
right.
so here, what credit should do is people probably should be fair. The U.S. at that time was playing a better role. Let's put it that way.
Absolutely. There was a major, I mean, this is, of course, a previous period in American history. Now, the Americans were still going through the period of transition from the period when they were, a republic confined to North America. Then in the 1890s, they started to expand beyond North America. They basically took over Cuba, they occupied the Philippines and all of that. But there was still a strong sentiment in America that this wasn't really what America should be up to. And American policy in the 1920s was actually towards China was very proper.
Mhm.
I mean, this is well, I would say very proper. That's probably an overstatement, actually, but certainly it was a lot better than that of the other Western powers. They didn't operate outright concessions in China. They had a different outlook, and they tended to be very critical of what the European powers were up to.
Yeah, actually, even the United States, Woodrow Wilson was, I think he in the beginning wanted to give Shandong back to China, but then he
Yeah,
changed his tone. He
yeah,
wasn't too sure about that, and
no,
but he didn't do anything until
no,
Warren Harding came in, and Harding
yeah,
decided, okay, give it back to China. I think
yeah,
that's what happened. So
yeah.
even the United States wasn't, always. Um,
No, As I
And
say, it was changing. I mean, it hadn't become the outright imperial hegemon that it
Mhm,
became
mhm,
yet. So as I said, it was still conflicted. This is the time, by the way, when this is an issue at the time that is close to my heart. This is the time when there were the great American jurists of that period in the 1920s who started to think of a new system of international law based on equality between nations and states,
mhm,
and they played an instrumental role in developing the system of international law that we have today. Now, of course, America has repudiated all of that,
mhm.
but to a great extent, it had an American foundation. But that
Well,
was the old America, not today's America.
even back then, I think if you look at Woodrow Wilson, I think his policy is also very conflicted in my view.
Yeah.
He's the one who established the Federal Reserve, which we know are a collective private banks. All right. Even
Yeah.
though he believes in like a socialist kind of equality kind of a thing, he was trying to establish the League of Nations, which is precursor for the United Nations. So it sounds like he liked this equality idea, but he's also giving the US financial rights to a bunch of private bankers. So you see, just that there, I find
Yeah.
to me, it's a conflict. It's contradict each other for me.
Absolutely. Well, Woodrow Wilson is a very interesting man because he is, first of all, he was a committed racist, and I think this is something that one should not overlook, and it undoubtedly, to some extent, influenced his thinking. So he was very keen, basically, on self-determination and sovereignty amongst Europeans.
Mhm.
He was never quite felt the same way about people who were not Europeans,
Okay.
because I think basically deep down he thought they were inferior, and though he was something of an anti-imperialist. Remember, he was a Southerner
That's right.
who lived through the Civil War in the United States, and whose family had passionately supported the Confederacy. So Woodrow Wilson wanted. I mean, he didn't want big powerful countries to dominate smaller
Mhm.
ones, because he lived through that. But at the same time, he still had a sort of paternalist, racist view
Mhm.
about things, and he was absolutely someone who had no fundamental problems with the business oligarchy as well. Now, he's a very complex figure, and his administration is a very complex one as well. And he left lots of things unfinished, and he had lots of interesting and good ideas, which were never really brought to fruition because of who he was.
Yeah, one thing he also did was introduce I think, income tax, which
That's
many
right.
people in the United States says it's illegal, it's unconstitutional.
Yeah.
I leave that to the constitutional scholars, but there were people who think that's unconstitutional. Interestingly enough, Trump claimed that he wants to look into whether he could get rid of a federal tax or something like that. We will see, but there is an argument to be made that the whole federal income tax probably is problematic. I would think that.
Like yourself, I will leave that to the constitutional lawyers, of which I am not one, by the way. But I do know that argument gets thrown around. So who knows?
Yeah. And one more thing is there is also many people believe that if not for the Treaty of Versailles, China may never be a communist country. What do you think of that theory? So here's the reason I think people think that. One is you understand, the May 4th movement, right?
Yes,
Because
absolutely.
yeah, the May 4th is entirely, I think, organic students, and then the whole country got involved because they
Mm,
were so angry with this treaty. And
mm,
under that enormous pressure, the Chinese government refused to sign it. But in that movement, quite a few of the Chinese Communist Party leaders, they started their career there. So
that's right.
I think that's part of it. And the other thing is because they angered China so much, even though, it's the British who started the Opium War. But that was much more recent, like the Treaty of Versailles
Yeah,
was 1919, right? So
yeah.
at that time, people were so angry that they never fully forgive the European powers for this, in particular France and Britain. And so
I
when
think.
when Soviet came, Soviet wasn't part of that. So that's why they emotionally feel more closer to Soviet. What's your
Well, indeed, I think that is absolutely true. And I seem to remember. I don't remember exactly all the details, but I remember the Soviets actually at that time when they came to power also said that they would give up whatever bases or whatever it was that they still had in China. And I know that went down well with the Chinese people at that time. I think there is a lot of truth to this, that the behavior of the Western powers created enormous indignation in China. But I'm going to say something else here, and this is an area of Chinese history, which I think Chinese people obviously know an awful lot better about than I do. But my own sense is that there had already been a great awakening within Chinese society going back even before. I mean, I know his name is said differently in Chinese, but Sun Yat-sen had already, yes, exactly, had already become an enormously important figure in Chinese political life. He'd led the Republic, the Republican Revolution of 1911. He'd been pushed aside by Yuan Shikai and all those horrible people, to put it mildly, backed by the British. But I think that there was right across China already an upsurge of patriotism and of desire to make China again independent and free and to chart its new course. And I think that would have developed. That would have developed anyway. It's just that in the middle of all of this, even as the Chinese people were awakening, suddenly the Treaty of Versailles happens. And the Chinese people, as I say, in the middle of their awakening, are told, you're just people that we can parcel around, can hand over bits of your territory, and do all of those things. And well, we don't know what you think, but we don't frankly care, because you are a colonial people and you really don't count. So one can imagine that this provoked enormous anger. And yes, of course, there'd just been the Russian Revolution, and Lenin had a different, which he did. He had a very strong and very different perspective on these things, and he wrote previously what is still, in my opinion, the best book on imperialism. By the way, it's, in my opinion, his greatest scholarly work. So one can understand how all of these things came together in all sorts of ways. But again, to repeat, this is something that Chinese people understand and know about more deeply than I do.
And the Chinese people, the netizen conclusion is you simply have to be strong. If you're weak, you will be thrown around like that. It's true. In the Paris Peace Conference, China was not even physically at the table, but not negotiational at the table. Not really. China was on the menu.
Yeah.
It's true back then, but it's today. Ukraine is simply not really a strong country and being thrown around. Things hasn't changed much, has it?
No, it hasn't changed at all, not in any serious or significant way. This is absolutely true. But of course, again, I mean, Ukraine to a certain extent lent itself to this by agreeing to become a proxy for the Western powers in a conflict against Russia. And that was a disaster for Ukraine, as they should have realized. Now, China was in a different position, because China had always been a strong, powerful, independent country for most of its history, until the Europeans came and started to bring it down in the way that they did. But of course, the Chinese are the netizens who say that you have to be strong are absolutely right. If you give your independence away, then people will take it. As, by the way, the Russians discovered in the 1990s.
At the same time, do you think the Philippines, for example, or the Taiwan province, do they learn from this? I doubt it. There will always be people within those places that they don't see this as a cautionary tale, is it?
Oh no, well, absolutely not, because of course, within every colonial system, there are always collaborators. I
Yeah.
mean, the Chinese people remember that very well again. I mean, the man again I know is Chiang Kai-shek,
Check.
and the whole system that he created around him, and his wife, who, by the way, I remember very well. I mean, they're a good example of that, utterly corrupt, utterly owned by the Western powers. And they're not the only ones. There is always a class of people like that. And the point is that they are always out of, that they're not part of the sentiment of the nation, and they are frightened and hostile to the nation that they pretend to run. But there is always this it's called in the West a comprador elite. In other words, people whose loyalties are to the colonial power rather than to their own people, and who also, by the way, experienced disrespect from the colonialists, which they take out with anger against their own people.
Yeah.